Hello. So this video for Black History Month 2023, we're going to be talking about Frederick Douglass's The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. This is one of the most important anti-slavery books, and I would say one of the most important books, full stop, of pre-Civil War American literature. You know what? Fuck it. I'd say this is one of the most important books in the entire history of American literature. Douglass's memoir was incredibly important and influential in promoting the anti-slavery movement prior to the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, because Douglass was an incredibly well-spoken, incredibly well he was a fantastic writer. He was really, really good as a spokesperson for the anti-slavery movement, and he was able to translate his experiences as a slave in Maryland into these amazing stories and these great sort of ethical arguments against slavery. And this narrative played a massive role in that. As you can see, I've marked a bunch of stuff on here. I've got a bunch of tabs here. So I don't know that I'm going to talk about all of the stuff that I could possibly talk about. And even if I talked about all of the stuff I could possibly talk about, I'm not going to do justice to this. Let's just be straightforward about that. But there's some things that I think are really important here. So one thing is that Douglass does talk about that I think is maybe worth starting with is the violence of slavery, just the absolute brutality of the system. And there's a number of examples of this. He talks about seeing slaves regularly beaten, even slaves who hadn't done anything wrong. You'd never. I'm going to use the phrase who didn't deserve to be beaten, but that I don't want to imply that any human being ever deserves to be beaten, but you know what I mean. Like, he talks about knowing of slave masters or serving under slave masters who beat their slaves periodically just on the basis that slaves would do things wrong. He recounts one incident in which a man was shot in the head because he ran off during a beating. He was being severely beaten. He ran off into the middle of a river to try and escape the beating, and the overseer who was doing the beating came up, told him to come out of the river, and when the man refused, the overseer shot him in the head. And as Douglass repeatedly points out, there was no consequences for this. White people in Maryland could murder slaves, and there was literally no repercussions. So this is one of the things that Douglass sort of returns to over and over and over again. Other elements of this are, and I think in some ways the violence is definitely there. One of the things, though, that Douglass does note about the violence that he experienced in Maryland is that Maryland slaveholding was a much less violent system than in, say, the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, places like this, where cotton plantations were dominant. Their slavery was much more brutal, much more violent. Whereas Maryland, because of its proximity to Pennsylvania, to the non-slave holding North, they tended to be less brutal in their treatment of slaves. But psychologically, the brutality was still there. The inhumanity and the dehumanization of slaves was still there. And one of the things that contributes most to this is the destabilization of identities for slaves. Partially this is done through the breakup of families, partially this is done through, honestly, systematic rape by slave owners of enslaved women, and partially this is done through sort of destruction of the cultures that would have been brought over from Africa through the systems of slavery. But then the other big component of this is the purposeful keeping of slaves in ignorance, which Douglass talks extensively about, and I'm going to talk about, in part because I think this is one of the reasons this text remains so widely read, is because English instructors love this. English teachers love his literacy narrative, and we'll talk about that. But this idea of breaking down identities, destroying identities, starts from the second paragraph, really. Technically third paragraph, but the second paragraph is really short. So beginning of chapter 1, basically, he says, "My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It's a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result." So, yeah, I mean, the destruction of family units was a really, really important component of slavery. This was a way of undermining potential loyalties, potential networks of support and kinship that, ironically enough, were incredibly important to white Southerners, right? Kinship was and remains, actually, to many in the South. Networks of relationships, of family, etc., is incredibly important. And so it was systematically broken down by slave owners in order to destroy those kinds of connections and support among slaves. We see the same thing actually with the fluidity of identity, right? Because slave names were always open to being changed. A slave did not have a right to their own identity. And for instance, when slaves were sold, they might be renamed. They might sometimes have the last name of their masters. And this, for instance, is Malcolm X's. This is the basis of Malcolm X choosing the last name X, because he rejected his slave name. He rejected the name that was given to his ancestors in the course of slavery. And we actually see this as well, this instability of identity, once Douglass has escaped from slavery and made it to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he lives at the time of writing this. Incidentally, Frederick Douglass lived for a decent amount of time in my hometown of Rochester, New York. But what he says here, when they got to New Bedford, he and his wife, on the morning after our arrival at New Bedford, while at the breakfast table, the question arose as to what name I should be called by. The name given me by my mother was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I, however, had dispensed with the two middle names long before I left Maryland, so that I was generally known by the name of Frederick Bailey. I started from Baltimore bearing the name of Stanley. When I got to New York, I again changed my name to Frederick Johnson, and thought that would be the last change. But when I got to New Bedford, I found it necessary again to change my name. The reason of this necessity was that there were so many Johnsons in New Bedford, it was already quite difficult to distinguish between them. I gave Mr. Johnson the privilege of choosing me a name, but told him he must not take from me the name of Frederick. I must hold on to that to preserve a sense of my identity. Mr. Johnson had just been reading from The Lady of the Lake, and at once suggested that my name be Douglass. From that time until this, I have been called Frederick Douglass, and as I am more widely known by that name than by either of the others, I shall continue to use it as my own. So this sort of breakdown of identity, destruction of identity, is really, really important in slavery. There's also a particular set of practices that Douglass points to that break down slaves' identities. One of them being the preferences of the preferences of slaveholders for what enslaved people do during during their Sundays off and during holidays like Christmas. And that preference is that they get drunk. And what Douglass says about this is basically it's kind of like the Amish practice of Rumspringa, where at 18 Amish kids are sort of sent out into the world with the expectation being that they will go and like live in crappy apartments, and they will do a lot of drugs, and they will drink a lot of alcohol, and they will have a lot of sex, and they'll be like, actually, this kind of sucks. This doesn't seem like a good way of approaching the world. And then they will come back to Amish communities and commit themselves freely, debatably freely, to the church and to their life in those communities. Douglass basically says the same thing here. Like, the idea is that slave masters wanted slaves to get so drunk and just feel so shitty from drinking so much whiskey that when Monday rolled around and they got back and they were sent back to the fields, they'd be like, yeah, okay, freedom's not great. And it is this sort of deceptive thing, right? Because for the most part, freedom does not consist of, I'm going to drink a ton of alcohol all the time until I'm sick. And yet that becomes this sort of manipulative tactic for trying to make enslaved people believe that they are better off working. So the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of Douglass's narrative, and again, I think this is a big part of the reason why it remains as commonly read today as it is. Douglass has this amazing literacy narrative because early in his life, he's sent to Baltimore to basically be a companion to the son of Mr. and Mrs. Auld. And they're like the cousins or something of his master. They live in Baltimore itself rather than Talbot County, Maryland, which is where his master lives and the plantation is and all that. So they send Douglass to Baltimore. The Mrs. Auld, the mistress of this house, initially does not sort of understand that you can't teach a slave to read in this society. And the argument is basically that learning will make slaves unmanageable. will make slaves demand their freedom or to seek out their freedom. And this is exactly what Douglass's experience was. The wife, the mistress of this house, Mrs. Auld, taught him a few letters and then was prevented from carrying on with this. And Douglass sort of never goes back. He turns directly to learning, and he employs a number of ingenious strategies. So the one that he talks about here, he says, the plan which I adopted and the one by which I was most successful was that of making friends with all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took my book with me, and by going my part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I'm strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear of them, but prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. It's enough to say of the dear little fellows that they lived in Philpot Street near Durgan and Bailey shipyards. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them I wished I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will, and then we go into a quote here, you will be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. So we have this interesting element here. That even in his earliest days, Douglass is making these ethical arguments against slavery, the injustice of slavery. And one of the things that I think is really important here, and Douglass does make this argument, is that keeping slaves in ignorance was one of the key tools for ensuring the continuation of the system of slavery. Once Douglass learns to read, he resolves that he will become free. And so, in fact, the thing that his masters had most sort of feared became true. Reading and the critical thought that comes with reading created this insatiable desire for freedom, this sense that as a human being, he had a right to be free. And yeah, I mean, again, this quote here, this is one of the great quotes, I think, of American literature. Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. Again, this is a thing, English instructors love this, English teachers love this, this is why we teach this. It's an amazing literacy narrative. And it does this great job of connecting freedom to literacy. There's one last point I do want to talk about with Douglass's narrative, because this is a really important point for him, and I think actually it remains a really important point. He speaks extensively about the Christianity of the slave owners, and how some of the most Christian slave owners, some of the people who were most devout, would be the cruelest in their treatment of slaves. And he says this is a famous bit from the appendix. he says here, I find since reading over the foregoing narrative that I have, in several instances, spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. To remove the liability of such misapprehension, I deem it proper to append the following brief explanation. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. And he goes on from there. This is a really amazing bit. And actually, it, interestingly enough, harkens back to something that Olayuta Equiano says in his narrative, which was one of the key texts for the abolition of the slave trade in the late 1800s. The text came out in the late 1800s. The slave trade, I think, is abolished in 1803. But Equiano uses the phrase, "O ye nominal Christians." Douglass does exactly the same thing here. He says, this is not the Christianity of Jesus. This is the Christianity of the whip and the chain. And I think that's an incredibly important thing. And I think it's particularly relevant today in a society in the US, in parts of Europe, like Hungary or Russia, for instance, where we have the rise of Christian nationalism or Christian fascism. The idea that you can be Christian or have a Christian society absent compassion, absent support for the poor, absent love of one's neighbor, absent willingness to sacrifice for the good of others, all of these core virtues of Christ, that you can have a Christianity without Christ, is incredibly troubling. It was incredibly troubling to Douglass, and it's incredibly troubling, I think, to many people today.